Hello everybody and welcome to this video where I'm going to analyse the Carol Ann Duffy poem War Photographer. Now, as always when we're analysing poetry, we begin by looking at the poet themselves. There is a risk to just write down lots of things about the poet, but we really just want to look for details from the poet's life that prove important in helping us to understand the poem itself. So Carol Ann Duffy was born in 1955 and is currently the Poet Laureate, which is a very prestigious role appointed by the Queen to be sort of the nation's photographer. The first female Poet Laureate and also the first openly bisexual Poet Laureate as well. War Photographer was published in 1985. Now, in some ways that makes it quite an old poem from Carol Ann Duffy, who, considering she's still writing today, is very, very popular today. This is one of her older works, over 30 years old, and that helps us to understand one of the sort of contextual details about what's going on with the photographs in the poem, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the sort of method of developing photographs was something that not many people today perhaps would know about. Carol Ann Duffy was friends with Don McCullin and Philip Jones Griffiths, who were two photographers who were famous for their war photography, their pictures in war zones. In fact, this picture is one of the pictures, the top picture, from Don McCullin. And these were two very well respected photographers who did lots of types of photography but specialised in war photography. Now, Carol Ann Duffy was in a programme for Channel 4 in 1998, and she said in that programme that what interested her in writing the poem was the photographer and the difficult decisions he or she might have to make while taking pictures in a war zone. Before we go any further, I'll just explain the bottom picture here, which is a darkroom. Today we tend to take photographs in a digital format. That might be on our iPhone or on an SLR camera, and we'll plug them into the computer and edit them. But at the time that Duffy was writing in the 80s, it was a different process, a process which some people still use today, but which I'm sure many students perhaps won't understand, so I'll explain it here. The idea was that you would take a picture on a roll of film, and then you would have to go into a dark room, because if any of that film was exposed to light, it would ruin the pictures. And in the pitch black of a dark room, or with this red light as you can see here, you would actually put the film into this solution which would develop the picture, and then it would gradually appear in front of you as it developed. And that's a very important process that we need to understand when we're looking at the poem. So in the 1998 programme Passwords on Channel 4, Carol Ann Duffy said, "Those photographs are in the background, but I'm more interested in the photographer, in the dilemma of someone who has that as a job, to go to those places and come back with the images." Now that's really important, that Duffy's saying, look, it's not about analysing the specific images in the photographs, but more thinking about the person taking them and the dilemma of being a war photographer. And there's a nice line of metaphor you might want to explore between the war photographer and the poet, somebody who creates a representation of life as they see it that everybody else then looks at and explores. But Carol Ann Duffy is interested in the dilemma that is faced there. So I think the best way to think of the theme of this poem, if we're looking at it on the AQA exam board in the theme in terms of the cluster on power and conflict, is to see the theme as the impossibility of presenting the true horrors of war or conflict. Let's talk about structure. Interestingly, this poem has a very tight and controlled structure. There are 4 verses. Each verse or stanza has 6 lines. The rhyme scheme, as you can see on the left here mapped out, is very similar all the way through: A, B, B, C, D, D, E, F, F, G, H, H. It goes on and on and on. And everything is tightly controlled. And this is interesting because there are lots of ways you can interpret the tight control of the structure in the poem, through the lines per stanza, through the uniform rhyme scheme. You could say that it reflects the war photographer's job, who is trying to impose order on the chaos of war, is trying to make it palatable so that we can look at it, be temporarily moved, and then forget about it. You see, suffering in war cannot be controlled and neatly ordered. And there's a real juxtaposition here. A juxtaposition is putting two opposite things next to each other to exaggerate the difference, because we've got a very tightly, neatly ordered and controlled structure, but a theme or a topic of the poem, which is the chaos of war. So the two contradict each other here, and a contrast is something we see throughout the poem. It seems that throughout the whole poem there's an unending message of what we see and think about war and the reality of war, which is impossible to understand. So we could say the unchanging structure also shows how the war photographer's efforts are futile. Nothing changes. He's trying to make us realize the reality of the horrors of war, but everything just carries on as normal, represented by verse after verse carrying on like the previous one, and his efforts are futile. What else is there to say? Well, rural England is between two full stops. This is a structural device. It's caesura, which is where we are forced to pause or stop, in this case from full stops within the line of poetry. But rural England is therefore separated completely from the descriptions of the war zones by the two full stops. And this is like how the people in the poem are able to separate what they see from the reality of the situation. It's all about the fact that we would look at these images of war and be temporarily moved, but fail to really grasp the true horrors of war, and just carry on with our life. This is also represented through the half rhyme in the line with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. So if you have a look down in the final verse, there's the half rhyme, the mid-line rhyme of tears and beers, and that actually quickens the pace in this final verse, and I think it represents the speed at which people forget. So the idea is they'll look at these pictures and they'll be sad for a second, and isn't that true? Isn't that what happens to us? We're overloaded with this sensory imagery, aren't we? And we're very sad, but then we might forget about it. So the rhyme of tears and beers, the rhyme within the line, speeds up the pace of this line and reflects the speed at which people forget the horrors of war. And there is also a cyclical structure in the poem. It begins with the war photographer coming back from a trip. In his darkroom, he is finally alone. And it ends with him going back out on another trip from the aeroplane. And there's this idea of a cyclical structure, that it ends where it starts again, with this journeying to and from a war zone. And any time a poem has a cyclical structure like this, where it ends where it begins, it links to the theme of fate, as if everything is predetermined and set. There's no escaping it. It's just going round in a loop. And the sort of futility of the war photographer's job, in that he's trying to make an impact and make people realise the true horrors of war, but how people are just sort of sanitising it and taking it as a quick 2-second glimpse of sadness, and then carrying on with their very ordered and structured lives and forgetting about it, and how that's such a futile endeavour. So those are some points to do with structure. You know, the fact that there are 4 stanzas, 6 lines per stanza, very ordered rhyme scheme, and how that reflects the fact that the war photographer in some way orders or tries to impose order on the chaos of war, and but how that's a juxtaposition, because structurally there's this order, but thematically war is chaos, we cannot order it, and how the unchanging structure, tied in with the way that it begins and ends in the same way, shows the futility of the war photographer's job, because people just don't care, as represented by the half rhyme in the final verse, which shows how quickly people forget. Now let's have a look at some things to do with language. There's loads of language in this poem. I'm not going to go through it all because, you know, I'm sure this is some of the things that people will pick up straight away or be covering in class. Some symbolism in the first verse. So we've got the dark room and we've got the red light, and both of those have very sinister, sort of evil connotations. And that contrasts greatly with, in the same verse, the religious imagery of church and mass. And I think this is quite interesting, because you could say the religious imagery suggests that there's a serious, solemn role to his work. But there's the contrast between the evil, sinister imagery of dark room and red light, and then the religious, if you like, sort of sanctified imagery of church and mass, again is a contrast in the poem, a seeming contradiction. And contrast and contradiction, as I've just gone through in the structure part of this video, is really important in this poem. The idea of two things that are opposed, the idea of trying to make order out of something which is chaotic. And I think the imagery in verse 1 backs up that contrast. Imagery that is quite interesting as well, the spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. Well, the ordered rows reminds us of war graves. And there's an interesting thing in war graves where, again, it tries to sanitize it. Everything's very structured and organized. But of course, that isn't what war and conflict and real suffering is like. We try to sanitize it and make it pretty, but it is anything but pretty. All flesh is grass is an interesting line. It actually is an intertextual reference to the Bible. It's found in the book of Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 6. And what is being talked about in Isaiah is the sort of transitory, fleeting nature of human life. But it's also the name of a Christina Rossetti poem, which is about the same topic, that life comes and goes in an instant. And you could say that, you know, the poem in its reference to Isaiah and the Christina Rossetti poem is just highlighting the fragility of life. And that the fragility of life through the Rossetti poem and then through the biblical scripture is something people have been writing about for thousands of years, yet still somehow we ignore it, like we ignore the war pictures in this poem. We might think about it for a second, but we don't fully acknowledge the fragility of life as represented through the intertextual references that are so historic here. You know, it's almost like this has been going on forever. But we still kind of hide away from it. What else is there to talk about? Some interesting plosives in line 6. Now, a plosive is where we have a consonant that is produced by stopping the airflow using the lips, teeth or palate. So p and b sounds are two of the plosives, and we've got them all here. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, and these plosives sort of have this kind of sort of quick fire pace, a bit like gunfire. So the plosives break the peace of what went before and give us this quick blast of ba-ba-ba-ba-ba, sort of gunfire. But also there's a structural device here, a caesura again, because the full stops again break up the lines. And what we would like to do here is probably just read these place names and move on, but the full stop forces us to stop and think about Belfast, about Beirut, about Phnom Penh. And the whole poem, of course, is criticising how we don't stop and think about the reality of war, the reality of conflict and suffering. So the structure here makes us stop and think about just that. Another strong image in the poem is this idea of a half-formed ghost. And this is an ambiguous phrase. It can be seen in a lot of ways. You can think that perhaps it's half-formed because as the picture is developing in front of the photographer's eyes, it's starting to fade into existence and come into existence, and therefore it's half-formed. Or half-formed could represent how this person was injured in whatever way it was that he was, you know, mutilated. And, you know, it could even mean that it's half-formed because it's half a memory, you know, it's not fully remembered. Finally, the last line of the poem talks about he earns his living and they do not care. And there's an ambiguity here. Who is the they who doesn't care? Is it the public who look at these pictures in the newspapers and quickly forget? Is it actually the wider world who's apathetic about others' suffering? And is it us as the readers of the poem who would read it and then quickly move on and forget? So in terms of the, you know, the cluster of poetry and the sort of war or the power and conflict idea. I think the poem is really about the futility of being able to try and express the reality of conflict. But like I said, a lot of the poems are about that. A lot of the poems try to express something and sort of come to the conclusion, I can't express this. So Ted Hughes tries to express the horrors of war, and in doing so has to borrow from Wilfred Owen because he can't, in his own words, express the true horrors of war. Whereas what we have with Duffy's poem is actually there is the ability to express the true horrors of war, but it's almost just as futile as everything else because people don't fully engage with it. They give it a fleeting look and then move on. So I hope you found this video useful, guys. What I've tried to do in this one is not go through every kind of photographic image in the poem because it's so visually rich, but just to go through some of the things that perhaps most people might not spot. So I hope you found it useful.